Okay, I think we'll get started. Well, welcome everyone to the Hallmark Affordable Housing Seminar Series number 6, where today we will explore affordable housing negotiations with a panel of experts with backgrounds in valuation, development, urban planning and housing policy. My name is Professor Alan Pert. I'm Director of the Melbourne School of Design and currently Chair of the Hallmark Research Initiative for Affordable Housing. Now, on behalf of the Hallmark team and our speakers today, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the university sits, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as acknowledging Indigenous owners who have been successfully living, designing and making architecture on these lands for over 60,000 years. Now, a quick introduction to the Hallmark Research Initiative for Affordable Housing. We bring together researchers from architecture, from urban planning, from property economics, public health, geography and sociology to acknowledge the complexity of housing systems and their role in supporting or inhibiting sustainability, social justice and economic stability. The intention of the Hallmark is to continue building a critical mass of affordable housing scholarship to shape international academic debate and to respond to contemporary housing problems. Importantly, the initiative builds on and extends the work of Transforming Housing, which was launched at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning back in 2013. Now, the seminar series to date has included research topics which explore how housing affects your health, a new history of post-war medium density housing, exploring housing options and challenges with Melbourne's African migrants, and the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable households. All of these seminars are available as recordings on the Hallmark website. Now, today's seminar explores the impact of Victoria's voluntary affordable housing agreements on councils and developers. In June 2018, the Victorian Government made changes to the Planning and Environment Act designed to encourage the negotiation of affordable housing agreements between developers and local governments. This was a huge step in the right direction, delivering a definition, a mandate and a mechanism for generating affordable housing through the planning system. Today, our panel will discuss their experiences and their perspectives on these agreements, and they'll present their visions for how current attempts to use the planning system to deliver affordable housing could be improved. So, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to begin by introducing our first two speakers who will be given a joint presentation. Dr. Georgia Warren-Myers is a senior lecturer in property at the University of Melbourne. She's also the sustainability lens leader of the Hallmark Research Initiative for Affordable Housing. Georgia undertakes research into various areas relating to commercial real estate and housing, with specific interests in climate change, risk assessment, sustainability, and housing affordability. The core focus of Georgia's research is investigating the value and valuation of sustainability in the built environment. Dr. Kate Rayner is the academic convener of the Hallmark Research Initiative for Affordable Housing and a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne. In her role as the academic convener, she is responsible for shaping and supporting housing research across the university, including championing this seminar series. Kate's background is in urban planning, and her research focuses on cross-sectoral partnerships and policy networks for affordable housing, lived experiences and housing satisfaction among low-income households. It's fantastic to have you here, and I'll hand over to Kate and Georgia.
All right, I hope we've got the right screen. Just to note, I'm Dr. Georgia Warren-Myers, and Kate and I will be sharing the presentation today. So I'm presenting on behalf of our team who are investigating whether the recent introduction of the voluntary negotiations to produce more affordable housing is actually working. So this project was funded by the Affordable Housing Hallmark Research Initiative in 2019 with seed funding, and the project team consists of a multidisciplinary team covering academics from architecture, building and planning, Faculty of Business and Economics, Geography and Psychology. The research project comprised an initial online survey that was conducted in 2019. We received around 239 responses, with 148 valid responses across local and state government, developers and not-for-profits. Key to attaining these responses was through a conversation article that we published in The Conversation. The initial number of responses indicated quite a high level of interest. However, the survey was only focused on those who were actually working and practicing in this area at the time. The results are currently under review with a journal paper in the Journal of the American Planning Association. And we're hoping to we're planning to run this survey again later this year so that we can create a longitudinal study and track the changes within the sector and the industry and what's going on with the different stakeholders. We are also in the final stages of the interviews and case study development. We've currently conducted 20 interviews to date, which explored the experiences in the sector and honed in on projects that had been successful and unsuccessful. And what we wanted to understand was what were the different participant experiences and what were some of the aspects that drove successful projects and also the unsuccessful ones as well. So in Victoria, we've had a provision of affordable housing through various models, direct government provision, public-private projects, and also community housing-driven development. However, there's still not enough housing or dwellings being delivered to cater for the demand required. So in July 2018, the Victorian Government made changes to the Planning and Environment Act and noted that affordable housing was a key objective for urban planning. It also created a definition of affordable housing and provided income limits for households. And this provided a great mechanism in terms of being able to understand these. And finally, allowed for negotiation between councils and developers to integrate more affordable housing through negotiations in Section 173 agreements. And it is this last point, the negotiation of Section 173 agreements and its potential for success or failure, was the initiation of this project. So in particular, the questions we posed, and this was from both a property perspective, my perspective, as well as from a planning perspective, was around, firstly, what motivations and were these sufficient to enter into these types of agreements in the development? What implications did stakeholder interests, perceived personal gains, knowledge, information and trust have in these negotiations? And what was the recipe for success? Finally, negotiation is a complex area, even more so when you have very different skill sets and motivations and different stakeholders coming from different perspectives. So we looked at the negotiation literature and how this might help to inform policy design and creating opportunities for interaction between stakeholders in the future. The presentation that we're giving today reports on some of these interesting findings that we've found from the online survey and some perspectives from the interviews. We are looking at the interests, perceived gains, and then examine some of the barriers, in particular to delivery, knowledge, capacity, and importantly, trust. Finally, we examine respondents' preferences and their rationale for their preference in terms of the certainty, clarity, outcomes, and expectations for affordable housing. So some of the headline results that we found that were quite interesting from a developer's perspective, we found that 65% of the developers believed they had an ethical duty to provide social housing, and 60% saw that their reputations would improve as a result of being engaged in affordable housing negotiations. This would also lead to a higher likelihood that their developments would be approved, and only a small number believed that by participating in these negotiations, it could improve their profitability. Now, we just need to probably note that the survey was undertaken with those who are actually active within the sector at the time. So this is, I suppose, reflective of that and is not, I suppose, a general consensus across the industry. Whilst for local government, 85% believe it's their ethical duty, while 62% saw these voluntary agreements were going to be a very important mechanism for actually achieving more affordable housing within the municipality. And that the approach to affordable housing was going to be seen as politically popular by about 45% of the local government respondents. So I'll now hand over to Kate, who is going to move into the perceived gains, knowledge and trust considerations.
Thank you, Georgia. So if we kick on to the next slide, I will, yeah, perfect. So one of the things that we were really interested in looking into was this notion of whether there was a potential for mutual gain or the potential for stakeholders to generate a better outcome by engaging in a negotiation than if they just decided to avoid the negotiation in the first place. And what we found is it's actually quite tricky. And one of the biggest problems is a lack of capacity to enforce negotiated affordable housing contributions on the part of local councils leading to actual built form affordable outcomes. The other, and probably the biggest issue that was identified, is a lack of incentives for developers to justify these affordable housing requirements. And these are topics that came up time and time again in the interviews. The other issue, I guess the other barrier that we were looking into is this, this knowledge barrier. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what we found was quite a large disparity between levels of development feasibility for local councils and for private developers. So there's quite a big gap there. And the other thing that came up quite a lot, both in the survey and in the interviews, is a lack of understanding within private developers of how the affordable housing sector works, the stakeholders within it, and the business models that they apply as well. And so I guess one of the ways that this lack of understanding, or this, this lack of shared vocabulary plays out is in this example from a local government representative who said it was like, we want a standard 10% affordable housing across the whole site. Now, 10% of what? There was such a lack of understanding about the value that was asked for at the time, and probably still is in some ways. And this is really speaking to the vast difference between a 10% affordable housing requirement based on a 20% market discount versus a 10% affordable housing contribution based on gifting units. There's a huge difference in value there that is increasingly getting worked through, but was a challenge at the time of these interviews. The next issue is around this relationship or trust aspect. And what we found is that according to local governments, they really believe that they're not manipulating information or participating unfairly, although the rest of the sector was a little bit skeptical about that. But for private developers, there's a pretty widely held belief that there will be some level of manipulation of information, even when private developers are referring to themselves. Although, of course, when we talk to people about specific examples, this wasn't always the case, and there were some examples of some really good relationships emerging. And one local council said, we had a really good relationship with the landowners. For me, the big one was don't go in with the attitude of trying to screw over the developer. The developer isn't the bad guy. In a different situation, a developer referred to a bit of procedural blackmail. So perhaps there were different experiences in different places. But one thing we found across the board, fairly unanimously, was a really strong preference for mandatory affordable housing contributions, or a form of inclusionary zoning. And the situation that we have now of voluntary flexible affordable housing agreements really coming in third place across different sectors. And there's a number of different things to unpack within that. But from a developer's perspective, what they really want is something that's fair for any developer or any council. I think everybody just wants certainty. It's only later on that's when the goalposts get moved, that's what can create challenges. So this notion that if you signpost affordable housing contributions early enough, it makes for a far more efficient and appropriate process. This really came into conflict with a push from the state government to generate creativity or different development outcomes. And as one state government representative said, the one question I got ad nauseum from the market was, well, how many affordable dwellings do you want? It's like, well, you tell me based on your development model what is going to be feasible for you. And there's going to be a variety of outcomes. So I guess this is where that creativity element comes into play. And then finally, there's this notion of embedding expectations. So from one state government person, I think a mandated system will deliver more because it is more reliable. It will demonstrate that we've got a pipeline. We can start to direct it to projects where we need those projects. And from a local government person, you know, there's an expectation politically embedded in the organisation that these big developments, we're not going to let them go anymore. We're going to win. We're going to get these through. So this idea that the more politically embedded it is, the more likely that outcomes are going to happen. So just to summarise really quickly, we believe that negotiation outcomes really emerge from this interplay between the capacity for mutual gain, stakeholder interests, access to knowledge and certainty and trust. I think there's a really broad desire for greater certainty and mandatory inclusionary zoning in the sector. There's an increasing understanding in the industry and expectations around delivery of affordable housing, but we have a long way to go. And outcomes are really still quite small and time-consuming and quite frustrating in the conversations that we're having. So we have a paper coming out, we're working through our case studies, and we're hoping to do another survey at the end of this year. So watch this space, and we'd love to keep engaging with the industry.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Georgia, for the first presentation. And just a reminder for all participants, we will be running a Q&A at the end of the presentations. So if you could please use the Q&A function to post any of your questions for the panel. Now, our second presentation tonight is from Ben Catwell. Ben is responsible for leading Stockland's communities built form development business nationally, while overseeing new acquisitions, planning, delivery, and overall financial performance of the business. He's also passionate about delivering communities, homes, and customer experience which enhance Stockland's brand, and in the process build a strong and respected reputation for the broader team in the industry. Ben, welcome. Thanks for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me along. I'll just pull up a presentation here. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Great. I'll jump into it. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I thought I'd start with how we're approaching affordable housing at Stockland more broadly, as well as what we're doing in relation to some of the projects that we've got, and I've got some examples here. But effectively, we've got a broad approach to how we're approaching delivering to the needs of our diverse communities and providing a diversity of housing opportunities. Yeah, and we believe that that does enable us to have an opportunity to contribute positively to that ongoing affordability challenge, which has something that really requires all of us to lean into and work through. And we've seen, and having been involved in the introduction of the voluntary housing agreements, we've seen that they have assisted in being able to provide some framework to negotiating contributions early in the development life cycle. But I'd stress there that it really needs to be very early on, and ideally at that point of rezoning, which was similar to the sort of research that came out we just saw from Kate. In terms of just from a definitional perspective, affordable price points versus affordable housing, that there is a difference. But we're looking at it from a housing market spectrum. But being able to provide affordable housing in relation to the definitions under the Planning Environment Act, we're approaching that through a range of mechanisms, but primarily selling the end product in a turnkey manner, which is effectively tenure blind to an affordable housing provider. And we've actually gone out and mapped the entire market nationally and selected key partners in each state for this activity. Then we've done some gifting of housing, where essentially in the nature of the transaction up front, we've purchased sites within the knowledge that we would gift housing, and then other options are around shared equity, and then being able to make those homes available for our housing providers, with a full range of housing or qualifying income. So we're not necessarily limiting ourselves to one particular segment. And then the other component where we've focused on is delivering market housing, but at affordable price point. So being able to provide housing in that space, really helps us serve those people on sort of the moderate incomes and above, with the earlier example being more focused on those lower income households. Now, I thought I just got a couple of examples to share. So the first one is our Altona North, which Stockland controls 3 parcels in this precinct over in this corner here. This was one of the first of the new voluntary commitments. There was an opportunity, or the way it was structured is we could provide either completed product or a cash contribution. And whilst this is still underway, we've just started construction now. Gives an idea of some of the lead time, but this was included at the point of rezoning. So we had clarity on the total commitment. We didn't have clarity exactly on the actual dollars until a bit later on, but in terms of working with Hobson's Bay and the VPA, that's been, I think, an outcome that provided a lot of certainty through the process, and we'll end up delivering completed homes to our community housing provider in this precinct. The reason we chose that is we wanted to be able to control the outcome and not just hand over cash that we weren't sure of when it would be spent into some pot of money, whereas we felt like we could contribute that immediately. We've got Waterley, which is a project we're delivering in Rover. We're about 2/3 of the way through it. It's a 6-star Green Star community. We purchased the site from Knox City Council, and essentially in that upfront we agreed the types and locations of affordable housing with Knox, who are also obviously the planning authority. So the social housing commitment there really was that we provided the land effectively to the housing provider, and then they would fund the building component only. So it was effectively still a turnkey solution, which we delivered for them, but it was a different mechanism again to the one I just outlined before. And then the last example I've got here is in Maribyrnong, which in our project Orion in Braybrook. As part of the rezoning, when the land was rezoned from industrial to residential, there was a commitment made for an inclusionary zoning, effectively for affordable housing. So providing 21 homes, and I should say that we're in partnership here on these homes with Common Equity Housing Limited. On the earlier site that I showed was with Housing First. And one point to call out across all 3 sites is that they're all very different. So having a standard framework does help us from our perspective in achieving greater clarity. From going from council to council, it's quite difficult to try and get your head around multiple different approaches. So from a developer's perspective, it's probably echoing some of the points made earlier, but really around having that clarity up front, really understanding the need for affordable housing and who are we actually designing and targeting for that product. So being able to provide, determine that early. Then from a viability perspective, being able to understand how do we actually price that. We need to be able to understand the cost and ability to deliver that, and how that would work at a financial level for each project, so we can quantify it. And then in relation to the voluntary agreements, unless these things are called out right up front, being able to make a voluntary contribution really is going to be more challenged the later it's left in the process. But having that, approach, we still do believe that we can contribute meaningfully and make some contribution. It's just that I guess the quantum of that contribution is more challenged the later it's left in the process. So that's my slides there, Alan.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And as I said earlier, just a reminder for all the participants just to use the Q&A function to lodge any questions for Ben, which we'll address at the end. Now, we're just going to jump straight into a third presentation from Steph Harper. And Steph is the lead valuer of CBRE's residential investment valuations team and an industry specialist in affordable housing and the accelerating build-to-rent sector. Steph is at the forefront of this emerging asset class in the Australian property market, offering clients quality valuation and advisory services to better inform business decisions as this sector builds momentum. Steph partners with clients at a local and institutional level, including developers, private investors, operators, government entities, financiers, and not-for-profit organisations. And Steph has experience in valuations across multiple asset classes and is based here in Melbourne. Welcome, Steph, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for the invitation to present my experience in this market. Ben, it's great to hear that Stockland is very keen to get involved in the sector. And it was really interesting, Georgia and Kate, to hear your presentation as well on some of the initiatives that are happening. I thought I'd provide a slightly different side of things today, a slightly different point of view. For the last couple of 18 or 12 months, I've really been focusing on build to rent and affordable housing, or what we're sort of calling residential investments. And it sort of enabled me to review not only international markets, because the whole build to rent multifamily sector also incorporates some sort of affordable housing. It's also opened to my eyes as to how those sectors operate as well. And there's two big things that come to mind. And I guess firstly, that our affordable housing mechanism through the planning system, which we have here in Victoria, is very similar to the UK. And secondly, that affordable housing is essentially a separate market on its own. So housing associations are subject to their own set of rules, and they're considered a subset of the government. So it's very, very different to, say, the general market, which actively involved in the development sector for commercial, retail or residential development. It is very separate. Here in Victoria, while we don't necessarily have a mandatory inclusionary zone, we do have a number of local governments and precincts which have a draft or existing affordable housing strategy. And what that means, as we've already been through before, is that a planning permit will require a portion of the stock to be sold or to be managed by a housing association. And ultimately, a restriction will be placed on title, restricting the use to provide accommodation to very low and moderate income earners. These agreements are actually a really powerful tool that we can use going forward. Hopefully, we'll be able to sort of get a better idea as I get through what I've got to say. But the restriction on title is a legal restriction, and it's implied to be there in perpetuity unless government or council agree to remove it. The Section 173 agreements are also very similar to what they have in the UK, and they call them Section 106s. The stock is required to be sold under these agreements, and negotiation occurs between a housing association and developer. Most of these bids are actually based on affordable housing rent, but also the cost to operate and manage for affordable housing use. Generally speaking, the contributions from the government, fundings, grants and subsidies are not actually included as part of that transaction price, which means that housing associations have the ability to afford the stock, and it also means that they can afford to service the loan for the stock. There's a little bit of a burden to the developer, but the prices are not considered to be market values or similar values to the general market. Instead, what happens with that funding money in the UK is grants or contributions go elsewhere. So the funding actually goes to the gap towards construction or operational costs. It goes towards investment in other forms. So if you're wanting to purchase stock that is potentially above that mandatory requirement, and it also goes towards other supportive services that form part of housing associations. What it means is that the planning mechanism for affordable housing is a fairly self-sufficient process in the UK. So we've got stock that has a requirement to go to the housing associations, and a developer and an association agree on a price that is a fair price based on what the requirement is. What I've seen in Victoria is that most of these negotiations often include government funding, and we get to actually see some real affordable housing value as such, which sort of brings me to another point as to how the planning mechanism is actually structured. I think Ben mentioned before that we need to know exactly what these contributions are in terms of whether they're gifting or whether they're shared equity, whether they're targeting towards low income or moderate income earners. the parameters at the moment are very broad, and it means that it is difficult for associations to negotiate. I guess if we take, say, a single, the single income, which is essentially rent can range anywhere from $139 to $426 per week. And that's really not much certainty around the income. And the broad parameters at this point are really difficult, and it's difficult to create investment into that sector or into the affordable housing sector. So I think that the next steps in terms of housing associations and local government can do is really collaborate together. Affordable housing rents in the UK are actually set based on a formula. So the rents are based on local house prices, average incomes, and a number of bedrooms in the dwelling. And it's not actually based on the percentage of income. I'm not actually saying that that is probably the right way to go about things, but my point is that by refining the requirements, we're able to create more certainty around that rent. And it will, in fact, be easier to negotiate outcomes with developers. And when we have more certainty around what that rent will be, it means that equity can ultimately be attracted to the sector, which will help accelerate the sector as a whole. There are a few things that I think that moving forward we can really consider, and hopefully that it will start a little bit of a conversation, particularly when we've got our panel discussion. But is our funding going in the appropriate areas that we need it to go? Should we be using funding to acquire, say, stock that's purchased through planning permit requirements and Section 173 agreements? Are our affordable housing models sophisticated and consistent across all associations to negotiate similar outcomes? And what deliverables or types of accommodation do we really need from the affordable housing planning mechanism that is in place? Do we need social housing? Do we need low income? Do we need moderate income? Do we need a combination of all different affordable housing? Should we be able to enable a consistent approach that is equal to the same value? And by refining some of the planning requirements and putting a consistent approach in place, we're actually able to create a value for affordable housing stock, which ultimately means that the sector can accelerate. And when the sector accelerates, it means that we can ultimately get more housing stock, affordable housing stock. But certainly some considerations there around where the funding's going and what we actually need through the planning mechanism that's in place at the moment. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, many thanks, Steph. We're starting to get questions coming in the Q&A. So just encourage everyone to keep adding your questions in. And we're coming on to our last speaker now. So just like to welcome Melanie O'Neill. And Melanie is a social planner with a background in urban planning. Melanie also works closely with statutory and strategic planners to create and identify opportunities to maximise the creation of affordable housing at the local government level. So Melanie, as a final speaker, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'll just share my screen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Hobsons Bay is located on the traditional land of the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I recognise the First Peoples' relationship to this land and offer my respect to the elders, past, present and emerging. I acknowledge the barriers many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples face in the housing market and their disproportionate representation requiring homelessness services and affordable housing. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are identified as a priority population in our policy, A Fair Hobsons Bay for All. This policy links with Council's affordable housing policy and strives for Hobsons Bay to be an inclusive and equitable place to live. The Hobsons Bay affordable housing policy aims to ensure all households in the municipality are able to live in affordable, secure and appropriate housing. Council has a long history of affordable housing policy, and since 2002 we have sought to collaborate with the private sector to create affordable housing within developments. The current policy acknowledges that affordable housing should be created through a range of methods and outlines negotiations with the private sector as part of that solution, together with other initiatives including advocacy and utilisation of government-owned land to increase the supply of affordable housing. Our focus on affordable housing has strengthened over time, and the current policy seeks 10% affordable housing within strategic redevelopment areas and sites. But as Kate mentioned, 10% is a really difficult figure to actually quantify and figure out what that actually means for each individual development. The policy also outlines that we will request that affordable housing be included in activity centres and established suburbs for developments that include 20 or more dwellings. Having this established position and percentage helps developers anticipate a request for affordable housing, and we have successfully reached agreements to deliver affordable housing within rezoned areas and large developments, such as Altona North example that Ben mentioned earlier. The changes to the Planning and Environment Act in 2018 supported our approach to negotiate for affordable housing and to utilise Section 173 agreements. While Council has been successful in reaching agreements to deliver affordable housing, we have experienced difficulties through the process and have not seen affordable housing created at the scale needed. In my role at Hobsons Bay and from the research work I'm conducting with Georgia and Kate, I've experienced firsthand and heard from a range of stakeholders who have participated in the process of voluntary negotiations that they are unpredictable, uncertain, and ineffective in delivering affordable housing at the scale that's required in Victoria. In my role at Hobsons Bay, I've experienced a range of challenges that have influenced the outcomes of negotiations. I'll now go through some of those recurring challenges that I've experienced. One of the most important challenges to overcome is ensuring that conversations on affordable housing commence as early as possible in a development life cycle. And I'm echoing Ben's point to this. This can be a significant challenge though, because affordable housing is just one thing among many that planners and developers and consultants need to consider. But early conversations can lead to mutually beneficial outcomes. At Hobsons Bay, the conversation is triggered when an application is referred to me by either a strategic or statutory planner. As I mentioned, the earlier affordable housing is discussed, the greater chance that an agreement can be met that satisfies all parties. And this is for a number of reasons. This is because the contribution can be considered as part of the overall community benefit that's created by a development. It can be factored into feasibility assessments and the built form. And negotiations usually result in a number of lengthy conversations between stakeholders. So the earlier affordable housing is discussed, the less likely that negotiations will negatively impact the overall timeframe for development. The time taken to reach an agreement for affordable housing is impacted by a range of factors. This includes the complexity of a development proposal, available resources, and the ability to agree on what is actually a realistic contribution. Even once an agreement is reached, it must then be documented by a Section 173 agreement. And this requires legal representation from both parties, more conversations, and many rounds of reviews to ensure that the intent that was originally discussed is being documented accurately. The documentation via a Section 173 agreement is unlikely to occur after that, straight away after that initial agreement is reached. In most cases that I've seen, the planning scheme amendment or permit condition would require that the Section 173 agreement be documented prior to subdivision. So you've then got a lengthy amount of time between those initial conversations and then once it's actually documented. The method of contribution, whether it be dwellings, cash or land, is discussed throughout those negotiations, but often is not agreed to until the contribution is ready to be made. And this is because it requires the involvement of a housing agency and their ability to be involved in that transaction. And it's often once it's time to involve a housing agency that more challenges are identified. The challenges can be that the size of the discount for dwellings is insufficient and results in a funding gap for a housing agency, or it can be that inclusions such as affordable housing in perpetuity in the Section 173 agreement can place a long-term burden on the operations of a housing agency. Councils are learning as we go, but given the infrequency of the negotiations, lost opportunities to negotiate result in lost opportunities to create affordable housing. So councils recognise that there's challenges faced when negotiating and that they impact all stakeholders. And I'm seeing councils take a range of different approaches to improve the process. At Hobsons Bay, one of the ways we are aiming to reduce the challenges is through the creation of the Hobsons Bay Affordable Housing Trust. The trust will sit separately from council and will be managed by Housing Choices Australia. And the trust will reduce challenges of negotiating for affordable housing by sending a clear indication to the market that council is committed to the creation of affordable housing, and developers looking at sites within Hobsons Bay should consider affordable housing as part of their due diligence. The trust provides a clear partner and mechanism for affordable housing contributions, and it can collect, hold and manage assets in the form of dwellings, land or cash, so it provides flexibility for the delivery of affordable housing contributions. The collection of contributions in a trust means that the value of affordable housing will be retained within Hobsons Bay in perpetuity. So ensuring that the time and resources spent in the negotiation process continue to benefit the local community in the long term. While the trust provides greater certainty to developers and aims to reduce the time taken to negotiate, it will still be dependent on developers wanting to enter into those voluntary negotiations. It will create and provide affordable housing, but it's unlikely to deliver the extent of affordable housing dwellings that are required in our municipality. If mandatory affordable housing were introduced through the planning scheme, we would have greater success in delivering affordable housing at the scale required. Mandatory affordable housing would provide an equitable, flexible and transparent method for affordable housing creation. But that's something that we'll need to wait and see what happens there. Thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Fantastic. Well, that concludes all our presentations, and if we could just invite all our panellists to put their cameras back on and unmute themselves. I'm sure we're going to have quite a robust conversation after all of that. Now, Melanie, if you don't mind, I'll maybe just try and pick up on some of that conversation with you before we go to some of the questions from the participants. I mean, one of the biggest challenges in all of this is having a consistency across local councils. We all know that there's, you know, like Hobsons Bay, there's other local authorities in Victoria that are working really hard at this to try and you know, tackle the affordability crisis. But from your own perspective, I mean, what are some of those challenges in terms of sharing knowledge? And is there the potential that developers are shopping around and trying to avoid some of these local authorities that have some of these kind of stronger policy matters?
So at a council level, we meet, the Metropolitan Melbourne councils meet every 2 months, and we share our learnings through negotiations that were happening. And as I mentioned, they're quite infrequent, so it's really important to have those sorts of conversations directly with other councils. I know that councils are at different levels in terms of having a policy as well as a strategy. So we also tend to provide review and feedback on new strategies that are coming through as well. So there is still a bit of a disconnect, and that's influenced politically by what each council is willing to do, but we do share information quite readily.
And I mean, just to extend that, I mean, one of the other challenges, I think, if we look across local authorities, is even just explicit statements on affordability. They mean different things to different local authorities. And I think there's really clear need to try and get some consistency across the board with that, which is obviously causing a lot of confusion out there for developers as well, in terms of what we mean by affordability. Okay, now, Kate, I'm just going to turn to yourself for a minute, because, I mean, I know, Kate, with Transforming Housing, we looked at other international case studies, places like Vancouver, for instance, or San Francisco even, where there is a much stronger policy around this and consistency. And I wonder if you could just maybe share some insights in any of that and what's going on over there, because there seems to be a lot more clarity in other places around some of these issues.
Yeah. So I think the major examples that we look to when we're doing comparison, and we could look broader, but what we've looked mostly at is Canada, the US, and the UK. And I think maybe I'll talk about the UK because Steph brought that up, in that the UK has had a long history of planning gain as a viable way of talking about delivering affordable housing. And it's been embedded as a planning consideration since like the 90s, and has been running for a really long time and is accepted. I think one thing that's been really good about that is that it has delivered quite a high level of affordable housing. It differs from part of the UK to other parts of the UK. So it's not completely consistent everywhere it is, but it is consistently an expectation that that's something that can be considered as part of a planning process. And so I think that's really interesting. Recently, there's been a bit of a rolling back of how much affordable housing can be delivered in the UK, but it has been running for a long time. I think one thing that's interesting about that is that a lot of the housing delivered in the UK is through a shared equity model rather than through a rental model, because it stacks up financially more easily, which I think, I mean, there's pros and cons to do with that, but it's interesting. And in fact, for the UK, there's been like lots of variation in terms of how it's come out. But I was reading the other day, what makes variation is the type of the developer and the timing of land acquisition. The clarity of the local government policy has a really big implication. The levels of demand for completed development, so how much market demand there is. Negotiation skills of the parties involved with local councils that have more experience in the area, getting higher outcomes out of them. And then the availability of subsidy, which is something that Steph talked about. So I think that's really interesting. In the US, it's really varied, but the programs that have mandatory processes with built-in density bonuses generally end up with higher levels of affordable housing, is what I've seen.
Right, great. Now, Ben, there's a couple of questions come in for yourself. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to look at some of the Q&A. I mean, Ross Hanson was asking how you select the community housing providers across those three examples that you outlined.
Yep. Yeah, I can go through that. So on two of the three, yeah, we went straight to effectively our panel, which we selected on the basis of reviewing, their business models, looking at their key people, their quality processes, and their ability to innovate. So really, who are the sort of best fit partners and like-minded groups to ourselves? And they're all the sort of names that you guys would know across the country. And then the other one was part of a selection process which we pre-agreed with Knox at the time of acquisition, which ran through. It actually had similar sort of criteria, but we actually ran through that with Knox because there were a couple of other elements to it. So that's how we went about it. So we had someone independent do it. Yep.
And then a follow-on question from Kate Breen is do you know if the housing agency partners need to secure government funding in order to purchase the discounted dwellings?
Short answer is typically yes, because we've typically gone for a higher volume of homes, so to sort of spread or deliver more dwellings. So through our negotiations, if they didn't have that funding, we could have gone for less dwellings, so that money would have gone and contributed without a need for funding. But yeah, typically there's been a need for further funding through other government programs.
Okay, now Ted Bailey's made the point about construction, and what he's suggesting is affordable housing assumes that current housing construction costs are immutable. Almost no assessment is made of why our costs are so high. For 3 stories or more, our costs are amongst the highest in the world. And sadly, our buildings are not the best in the world. And he's also then making reference to Stockland's examples, which are low-rise and greenfields, so not around transport hubs. All our cost shifts to other homes. The reason for these high costs must be first addressed. When will the Hallmark tackle this? Now, I think what's interesting, I think, Steph, and I don't know whether you've got a perspective on this, but I think the build to rent sector starts to make, suggest an opportunity to rethink this. And I wonder, if you've got a perspective on this. If you're building to sell and you're selling off plan, and suddenly moving to a build to rent market, there's a number of things happen there. You've got an asset class; it's a different asset class, obviously. So you've got a developer that's invested for a prolonged period of time. But there's also an incentive, I think, to try and look at other alternative construction methods. And it is something we've been talking about via the Hallmark, whether the build to rent sector will force a different type of construction opportunity. We've talked about off-site for 50, 60 years, but maybe there is an opportunity here to rethink. And there's maybe, I would be keen to hear, Steph, what you think about a post-COVID world and build to rent, whether it's something we're going to see a lot more of and more opportunity.
I think just the construction costs in general, that isn't an issue across the board. So I wouldn't say it's just for affordable housing. It's construction costs of development for build to rent, build to sell, and affordable housing. Build to rent can certainly provide a level of affordable housing included in their schemes. But I think it's really important to understand that a build to rent and a build to sell, whatever the requirement may be, whether it's a 5% inclusion or how it's structured, it actually has a different impact on value because they're two totally different classes. So you've got one that's a long-term asset, and then you've got one that will essentially be sold off at a particular point in time for a particular price. So that needs to be taken into consideration. But I still think that the planning mechanism is a bit of a solution to be able to provide affordable housing in those areas where construction costs are relatively high.
Yeah. Georgia, could I maybe invite you to come in on that as well, just thinking about construction and even with the sustainability lens on what's happening in the future?
Well, quite a bit, I think. But as Steph mentioned, the construction costs are across the board, and whilst some, I suppose, economies can be achieved when we say to go down a build to rent phase, a lot of it has to do with the broader economy and what's going on in the broader economy, and that demand for the different levels of trades that are driving those high prices. Another aspect is the continually increasing different levels of contributions for different aspects that have increased over the last 20 years, in particular in urban growth areas, that have also contributed to higher housing costs and then consequently pushing the broader cost for a dwelling up over the market. From a sustainability perspective, I think we need to start thinking a bit broader in terms of what does sustainability really mean, and how do we start integrating this into different developments of all kinds. And whilst the councils have also gone down a path of creating a sustainability scorecard for developments and things like that, not all councils have signed up to implement that, but that is one step. But perhaps maybe affordable housing should also be part of some of these considerations from a sustainability perspective. So, if you are going for a Green Star rating for a community or something like that, that affordable housing does comprise a component of that. So you're actually ticking the social sustainability component, as well as a whole lot of other environmental and economic objectives on the sustainability front.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. And again, just an extension of this, Andrew Martell is suggesting that there's an issue of housing quality and not just housing quantity for affordable housing. And he's talking about the UK context, where there's been examples of innovative modular housing construction for council housing estates that resulted in very poorly constructed buildings. And given the current worries about housing build quality in Australia at the moment, how do we ensure quality in this sector? I think there's an interesting issue about quality again with the build to rent sector. I do think that might change people's mindset. If you're invested in something for a prolonged period and issues of maintenance come up, then it might change the ideas around quality. Steph, I don't know if you've got any more perspective on that.
Yeah, I think sustainability as well, and also quality, is obviously a very important part of build to rent, and making sure that it's sustainable and what are the operating costs and all that sort of thing. But one of the things that I think is important to mention, that I'll go back to the planning mechanism that I keep talking about, but if you are buying stock that is essentially basic standard builder's quality and it may last 2 years, that should be factored into your maintenance costs on the price that you pay. So we need to start looking at that a little bit harder. And I think that when we're building a new, say, social housing building, do we go in for higher construction costs to make it more sustainable and top it up with funding, and then through our actual models, which should be very sophisticated, we then have a low sinking fund and a low maintenance cost? We need to start thinking about those numbers, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, yeah. Ben, we've got a question here about what's the property industry's view about inclusionary zoning? Now, I think we saw some pushback in the press recently about City of Melbourne's recommendations for their affordable housing strategy. Certainly some pushback coming from the Property Council. So Ben, I don't know if you've got any perspective from industry.
Yeah, I might just wanted to add a point to Steph's comment. So like one of the things around build quality, quality is quite a broad term in how people apply it. We, from a quality perspective in relation to construction quality, we would have a strong focus on that with our project management team, but also we have quality superintendents that rove around our sites, keeping an eye on our builders in terms of construction quality. And then in terms of selection of materials and affordable housing, we actually take an approach across the examples I gave earlier, that we don't actually differentiate what we're providing. So it's consistency. You shouldn't be able to tell who's living in which dwelling. And in terms of inclusionary zoning or any other mechanism, ultimately all we're talking about here today is who's funding the challenge we've got, and there's a whole range of funding sources through federal, state and local, and obviously we're focusing on planning and design here. But in terms of from a development industry perspective, the biggest thing we need is certainty. So, and then if there is a change in the targets or the quantum of housing targeted through any planning process, there needs to be a clarity and a transitional time frame, because that's where the industry stops. Either it stops with the landowners who won't sell to us because they're not getting the price that they think they need. We will only develop if we can make a return for our shareholders. And it's as simple as that, really. So, I guess I'm all for having clarity and certainty over what the objectives are, and I think once we've got that, we can deliver. The industry can deliver anything.
Kate, could I invite you maybe to come in on that as well, just about kind of inclusionary zoning? As I say, there was a bit of pushback recently on the City of Melbourne's, which was, after a couple of years of consultation around it, was quite frustrating to hear. But I'd be keen to just hear your perspective on that in terms of inclusionary zoning, and even just again on the percentages. We're talking about 10% often, but you look around the world, it's easily 20, 25, and 30 in some places.
Well, parts of London get up to 50%.
Yeah.
From the survey we did, we found great amounts of support for inclusionary zoning. As Georgia said, there's a bit of a skew in the data, in that the people who respond to the survey are people who are interested in affordable housing. So we had a number of developers respond, but it's skewing towards the inclusionarily zoned inclined anyway. But there is, and there is interest in it. There has been pushback against it, and there has been different industry groups that have kind of flip-flopped between support and opposition, depending on the situation. And I think a lot of the discussion now about inclusionary zoning will be couched in this narrative of, oh, it's COVID, we have falling land prices, we have a development industry that's about to fall off the cliff, now is far too scary a time. But we've been proposing this for 20 years. I think we can do it now and grandfather things and roll it out slowly and let it be something that the industry knows about and responds to. And if we start that conversation now, it becomes much easier than, you know, waiting another 5 years and then starting the conversation and stopping again. So I think there is interest in it, but often we will have people like property councils jump up and smash it down again at inopportune times. I think Georgia unmuted for a reason to jump in as well.
Yeah.
And I think whilst inclusionary zoning provides that greater level of certainty, I think in designing how we go about it, we also need to take into account the different types and typologies of housing that we'll be creating. So, you know, 10% might fly in a, you know, multi-story, 21-story apartment tower, but it may not necessarily work in a townhouse scenario in the middle suburbs. So we do need to perhaps have a bit more of a palette in terms of how the different levels or percentages or requirements might be altered in terms of the different sites. Now, this creates further issues because then you're like, well, depending on what I put on that site, it's going to then shade what contributions I'm going to be doing. And so that then might have negative consequences in terms of what gets developed there. But there does need to be some consideration for, you know, what will work in different sites and otherwise.
Now I've got actually it's a statement more than a question, but I think it's useful to read it out from Robert Praglin. Councils do not understand that affordable housing requires a subsidy in some shape or form unless it is factored into the feasibility study, is not able to be afforded by the market. And while industry groups support the principle of affordable housing, it needs to be paid for somehow and factored into the property purchase. I think it's a statement, but I think it's probably provoked someone. And Ben, do you have a perspective on it?
I'd say it's mixed in terms of Rob's point, but in terms of the level of understanding, it's mixed across councils and also industry. But I 100% agree that it needs to be factored into a feasibility, whether you're a listed company like Stockland or whether you're a private developer. You just can't get funding for something that is not commercially viable. So, I mean, whilst we really, want to believe in doing the right thing and contributing and pulling our weight, there's only so far we can go without it being factored into the feasibility. Like, it's just the economics of the situation, I guess, is the key thing to understand. There's nothing free, I guess, in life. That's the challenge, and how do we work together to do it? But I think the key is the certainty and having that with a long lead time. And there's a number of councils now that are, I won't mention names, but that have got policies that they're working towards or have got on exhibition that are seeking sort of 50% of uplift of rezonings. So again, it's probably more different alternative ways that they're all going about it, but I think there's no short of energy being expended in looking at different solutions to the challenge.
I could probably chime in on that a little bit too. I agree with Ben and Robert that it needs to be factored into the feasibility side of things for developers to understand what impact it might have. But it comes back to, what is that affordable housing stock worth? And we need to start understanding how those models work with some more certainty around what the planning system needs. So whether we're providing social housing, low income, whether you're negotiating shared equity options, there needs to be a value attributed to all that type of stock so that we can start putting it into the feasibilities and understanding what impact it may have on values.
And if I can just weigh in again, just building off the feasibility aspect, I think that's a really important consideration. And whilst developers fully understand how their models work and things like that, that level of knowledge and understanding within the planning side of things is not quite the same. And so that, I think, is where and certainly our research demonstrates that differential in understanding of feasibilities, and that we need to assist planners and those who are in the negotiation process of what the implications are when they say, oh, no, we want 10% affordable housing. Well, what does that really mean from a developer's perspective? And perhaps there needs to be a bit more, not necessarily transparency, but helpfulness from developers in actually helping the planners and those in the negotiation process in understanding the implications of some of the decisions and things that they're asking for. Because I think there's a nice pie in the sky, oh, this is what we can go for, and this sounds like a nice round number, but that doesn't necessarily equate easily across the table when we start running the FISOs. And certainly the other aspect is not changing things midway through. So changes to policies, and I know that there's a number of issues with developers south of the CBD who, went forward with one idea, purchased land, and then, things have been held up, and that's basically the result of holding it up and then also revising what building heights could be then achieved, has then meant the affordable housing components that they thought they could provide aren't going to be viable anymore. So that level of certainty, I think, is also very important from the developer's perspective.
Can I throw in a plug really quickly, since we have a captive audience? Georgia and I worked on a fantastic, obviously, piece of research last year or the year before, talking about this exact situation, and we framed it as the carrots and sticks of affordable housing. And we built a calculator that lives on the Transforming Housing website, and we'll put into the link for everyone who came to this event. Essentially looking at what is, it's bendy and everything is more complicated than you can put into one online tool. But what is the cost of a certain contribution? What is the value of a certain incentive? Playing with those economics. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to check it out, and we'll send out a link as well.
I was wanting to just pick up in this notion of subsidy, but even get back to the feasibility, but the role of land, land value in particular. And Steph, maybe this is something that you could touch on, or even Melanie, in terms of Hobson's Bay, but we're starting to see signs now of government-owned land on a leasehold, which suggests that it might have a huge impact in the way we start to think about subsidy. I was just wondering if there's anything, Melanie, even from Hobson's Bay, that you are exploring in terms of leasehold land.
We're not actually looking at leasehold, but we are looking at a development on government-owned land. So council owns a piece of land in Laverton, and we're exploring options as to how we can utilise the trust structure to develop that site. I know other councils have explored leasing, and some feedback with that has been that the inability to leverage the value of that land for purchasing other dwelling throughout the municipality has been not able to do that with that lease structure. So we're looking at how we work together with the trust, but it is definitely something that council is considering as part of that overall solution of how affordable housing can be created. We know that negotiating with developers is part of that puzzle, and we need to also look at how we can use our own assets.
The leasehold of land is probably more suitable to the build to rent model.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question about, is the Planning and Environment Act, are its aims realistic to think that council can negotiate affordable housing and development that is not the result of a rezoning uplift of other forms of government funding or land gifting?
Would you like me to answer that?
Yes.
I think it's not going to deliver what's actually required, the huge amount of affordable housing that's required in Victoria. But it is something that we do bring up when we see any developments over 20 dwellings. We'll ask how the developer can consider affordable housing as part of the overall community benefit. But it is a difficult conversation, and there's not many levers that council can pull for something that isn't a rezoning.
Yeah.
I think I can add to that as well. I think it's, again, having that clarity. Like, if we know that there's a really clear requirement, then you can deal with it and factor it in. Ultimately, just to give you some insight into when a developer goes to the market to buy a site or bids on a site, it's a very competitive environment we're in. There could be 50 or 100 other parties trying to buy the same site. So when we go in, we're basically trying to fine tune all of our assumptions and at our sort of hurdle rates. And there's really, to win a site, you really don't leave anything in the tank for trying to pay for anything that's not already been able to be forecast with any certainty. So that's probably where it gets difficult. So it comes back to, again, that certainty and clarity of what's required and the type of experience that we'll have as we go through planning.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, Ben. Do you think
go for it.
Across all local governments, there needs to be a sort of a consistent approach that would have an impact on a similar land value reduction as such? Like if there is a mandatory inclusionary zone, that each local government should have a structure that will have a similar impact on values?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I was just thinking it through. It'd probably mean different things in different places, because if you've got a really high land value, say closer to the city, versus a low land value further away, and you're trying to impact it to the same dollar amount or percentage amount, that may or may
more on the GR values.
Yeah, so that again, if a GR on the NGR.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you did that though, let's say if you're on the fringe of the city and you're selling something at 400,000, you might make, let's say you're making a 10% profit in either scenario. I'm just on the phone, mate. Sorry, I've got the kids here. Yeah, if you're 10% in each scenario, so if you took 40,000 off 400,000, you'd make 0 return, so you couldn't do that project. But if you're in an area where it's say $1 million and it's 10%, and you took 40,000 off, then that project could still potentially go ahead. So it's probably not quite the right mechanism, but it's how to make it work. I think it's a good way to think, to try and spread it equitably.
Do you think it's a good idea to have one local government that may have a gifting policy, and then you have another local government that might have, say, a 5% requirement, and it might be targeted towards moderate and low-income earners? Like the impact on ways are very different.
Yeah, there are. And what we tend to find, and this is nationally, that each local government is looking for that contribution to be made effectively to serve the residents of that local government. So it's quite insular. One of I guess the challenge for us is whether it was that, if it was consistent, that would certainly be easier in terms of the mechanism and quantum, but really it's just the certainty around the quantum is the main thing we're after. If it's slightly different in each local government, that's less of an issue than having no certainty at all when we're going into because there's lots of local governments in Australia, and we develop in a lot of them. It takes a fair bit of research to really get to understand what, across, and affordable housing is just one thing we're dealing with when we're going through a development in a new area. It's trying to understand what all of those various things are that are different in that local government versus all the other local governments that we work with. So it's probably, I don't have a perfect answer there.
Well, there's a question coming about tax concessions. Who wants to tackle this one? I mean, there's been lots of discussion about institutional investment and the federal level challenges we have. Anyone get any thoughts on that, on tax concessions? No?
I can have a go if no one else wants to. I mean, there's a lot of different taxes. It depends on which taxes you're talking about, but there's a lot of different types of contributions and taxes. Whether I guess if it was federal and you're talking, say, GST or state and land tax, or whether I know there's a lot of discussion for build to rent around MIT, which is withholding tax for foreigners. It's at 30% versus 15 for other types of asset classes. So I think it'll all help. We've seen recently in both New South Wales and Queensland where they've come out with incentives for affordable housing. Queensland, I think most recently, where there's a reimbursement of land tax payable as well as a top up to market rent for affordable housing. So that was announced not that long ago in Queensland.
Yeah. That was actually one of the questions that came in, was just about how does Victoria compare to other states and its complexity of incorporating affordable housing? And we have seen some positive moves in other states. Kate, do you want to come in on that in terms of what's going on elsewhere?
I don't have a good sense of levels of complexity in other places. I'm not sure, and I don't want to make something up, but I do know that if we're looking at states that have long-running examples of inclusionary zoning or embedded affordable housing schemes, then you would look to somewhere like South Australia or Western Australia. And South Australia has a long-running shared equity scheme, and also a long-running inclusionary zoning scheme. And in Western Australia, they've also had a long-running shared equity scheme. So they're really good from that perspective. But in terms of complexity of delivery, not sure.
Yeah, I can answer that or add to that. Yeah, I'd agree. From South Australia and WA, probably the two leaders in the country. And then, I'd say Victoria and New South Wales. Like Victoria's got better, but still got a way to go, and so does New South Wales. They're both similar. So to say they both lack certainty in different ways. And then Queensland, I haven't had a lot of experience there to comment on that, but I'd definitely say South Australia and WA are two stronger, but they've both got different approaches. So, and they both seem to be effective in getting, affordable housing into the market.
Okay, great. Well, what I'm going to do, just to conclude, if you don't mind, to just run through each of you. And Paul asked a question, which I think we've tackled to a certain extent, about how can the state government introduce greater certainty into the sector at this point in time. So now you can look at that from a government perspective or a local authority, but if we don't mind, could we just have a closing word from each of you on that topic? And we'll start, if you don't mind, Melanie, giving you my top left.
I think the certainty would come with that standardised expectation around mandatory affordable housing, and that would need to differ depending on the type. And George has already mentioned the complexity of that being apartments versus townhouses. But I think if we had a consistent approach, it would save a lot of time at a local government level for these voluntary negotiations.
Right, Kate.
I would agree with Melanie, and I would go sideways with the answer and say it's really important that the state government is delivering certainty, but it's more important that the federal government delivers certainty, because the majority of funding comes from the federal government to the state governments and is then delegated down in social housing systems and affordable housing systems. And if we don't have an NRAS, and we don't have a national strategy for affordable housing, and we don't have a social housing stimulus package coming from the federal government, then what can the rest of us do in state or local government or academia or industry if they've just checked out?
And Georgia?
Nice one, Kate. I'd probably support both in terms of the mandatory approach from a property and property valuation and development perspective. By going down the mandatory route, it provides a higher level of certainty, and if that's consistently then applied across all municipalities, but perhaps, as I mentioned before, there does need to be some tinkering in terms of the different typologies in terms of housing or development, but that would then flow in and eventually with everyone on the same playing field. Like, that's one of the big things that we hear continually. It's like, it's not an even playing field. If I go and do that development in that municipality where they've got 5%, but the one next door, which is only 300 metres down the street, doesn't have any requirements, why would I be going for that one when I've got to do so many additional aspects, particularly if there aren't any incentives being offered to the developer? So that would be the other thing, would be, okay, if we're not going to go the mandatory direction, we actually need to think a bit more broadly about better incentives to actually engage with developers to provide it and make it a more incentivised option to provide affordable housing in their new developments.
Great, thanks, Georgia. And Ben?
Yeah, I think, I'd sort of just echoing the points that have already been made, having that certainty, and having, if there are changes to make it mandatory or increase the quantum significantly, having an incentive from the state or federal government to support a transition, that would would work. I think I could see that being a successful solution. But I think it's about everybody leaning into the issue and doing their fair share of the heavy lifting.
Great, thanks, Ben. And Steph?
Yeah, I think the word certainty is going to get a belting, but it's definitely about the certainty side of things. And we just need to refine the planning mechanism that's in place and potentially the introduction of that mandatory inclusionary zone.
Yeah. Well, look, fantastic, guys. I think it was a really good afternoon. Fantastic presentations and a great contribution through the Q&A. So just a huge thank you on behalf of the University and the Hallmark for all coming along today. And Ben for parenting at the same time as dealing with your Q&A. Well done. I'm
That's
really
all right.
And look, just one final point, I think, just to plug for the Hallmark Seminar Series number 7, which will be taking place on the 3rd of November with Andrew Martell, who will be exploring Fit for Purpose, which is a discussion of regulations around housing for people with disabilities. I'd also like to make a plug for Thursday night, 8 o'clock, we have Nord Architecture from Copenhagen. I'll be hosting them in a conversation around the housing lab. So there's a project underway in Copenhagen over the next 10 years to deliver some significant housing, some really interesting work in terms of construction innovation, but also in terms of their mechanism for and funding for delivery through a philanthropic organisation, which I think is really interesting. So please join us at 8 o'clock on Thursday night, or for Hallmark number 7 on the 3rd of November. And a huge thank you to all the participants for listening in and all your contributions to the Q&A. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.